What's up, fight fans? My name is Indy Gold, and today's video holds a deeply special meaning as we come together to pay tribute to an incredible man. This man was much more than a mentor, much more than a friend. He was like a second father to me. I'm talking about Steve Lott. When fate brought Steve into my life, there's no way I could have imagined the profound impact he would have on every area in my life. When I met him, my life changed for the better. We used to spend hours on the phone, quite literally hours, sitting right here in this chair, sometimes talking until the sun came up about any and everything in life. And he always made time for me, and I always felt very special because of that. I never got the chance to ask him what he saw in me, but certainly he must have seen something. He helped me become what Jim, Bill, and Cus helped him become, and that's a true professional. Now I gotta tell you, my story in boxing starts in 2012. I was completely enthralled with boxing. I knew I wanted to manage fighters. I knew I wanted to manage exciting fighters, and I wanted to do right by the fighters. In 2012, I made a trip out to Catskill, New York, to meet with Kevin Rooney. And I had the pleasure of meeting Kev. We went onto the back steps of the gym, sat there. It was summertime. We talked for a few hours, and Kevin agreed to train my fighters. Kevin said, if you're serious about managing fighters, you have to connect with Steve Lott. He's the guy that can teach you everything you need to know. I connected with Steve. He was kind enough, even though he was setting up the Boxing Hall of Fame in Las Vegas, made time for me to have breakfast. Flew out to go see him, had breakfast with him. I came back, I swear to God, I didn't even need to be on the airplane. I could have flew back. I was on such a high. And I came back home. Sure enough, I had an opportunity to sign my first fighter. There's just one problem. I had no clue how to drop an agreement, how to drop a contract. I was totally clueless. I reached out to Steve. I said, Steve, I need your help. I can sign my first fighter, but I have no idea how to drop a contract. He sent me a message, and not just any ordinary message telling me that these are the points you need to put in an agreement. He drew up my first agreement for me. 4 pages, I'll never forget it, and I went ahead and I signed my first fighter. And that wouldn't have happened without Steve. No shot. And I certainly hope that at some point in my life I get to pay forward all the things that he taught me, all the love and respect that he showed me, all the time that he gave me, all the wisdom he shared. I hope that I'll be able to pay that forward and keep his legacy going that way as well. The night that we talked, and he told me that he wasn't doing well, that he was ill, and that he won't be around for much longer. It was an extremely emotional call for both of us, and we literally talked until the next morning. The sun literally came up. And the only reason we got off the phone was because he had to attend a doctor's appointment for those ailments that he told me about. Otherwise, I think we would have kept on talking. I'm 100% certain that I will never, ever come across anyone or have a type of relationship that I had with Steve with anybody else. I just don't think it's possible. It's such an honor and privilege that Steve chose me to carry on his legacy for him. I can't tell you what an honor that is. So we have a lot of friends of Steve's that will be speaking throughout the video as well. We're going to share his life story so you guys get a background of who Steve was, where he came from. I just hope he's up there, he's resting comfortably, smiling. He's hanging out with Cus D'Amato, Jim, Bill, Doris, Bill Cayton's wife, Muhammad Ali, all the greats up there talking boxing, just relaxing, having a good time, because he certainly deserves it. And I hope that I'm doing him justice, and I hope you guys enjoy the video. And Steve, I think about you every day. I miss you, I love you, and I hope you guys enjoy the video. Steve was born in the Bronx, New York on January 17th, 1950, to Leo Lott and Lillian Lerman. As hard as it may be to believe, Steve wasn't a boxing fan growing up. As a teenager, he was the national junior handball champion, and his success caught the attention of the late Jim Jacobs, who would go on to become his mentor. Jacobs was an obsessive collector of old fight films and was arguably the best handball player of all time. When Steve turned 21, he asked Jim for a job at Big Fights, and that's when Steve's life as a boxing fan began. Over a 30-year span at Big Fights, Steve produced films on Muhammad Ali, Joe Louis, Roberto Duran, Rocky Marciano, Sugar Ray Robinson, and almost every other legendary fighter. Steve's film credits include the documentaries Muhammad Ali, Skill, Brain, and Guts, Sugar Ray Robinson, Pound for Pound, Grudge Fights, Mike Tyson, The Inside Story, and Greatest One-Punch Knockouts. When Big Fights was sold to ESPN in 1998, Steve supervised the 3-year process of transferring and cataloging thousands of reels of original films and tapes from the Big Fights library into a digital ESPN database. Steve began assisting legendary fight managers Bill Cayton and Jim Jacobs in 1978 as assistant manager and camp coordinator for world champions Edwin Rosario and Wilfred Benitez, managing the training schedules, fight media, medicals, sparring, travel, and appearances. Steve's role expanded with many other fighters, including Vinny Pazienza, Tommy Morrison, Jeremy Williams, Michael Grant, and most notably, Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson shared Steve's apartment in New York City from 1985 to 1987. During that time, in addition to overseeing all Mike's pre-fight obligations, Steve was responsible for coordinating Mike's TV appearances, which included commercial shoots for Pepsi Cola, Nintendo, Kodak Film, as well as spokesperson roles for the New York City Police Department and the DEA.
What happened to 5 years that Mike was on the covers of magazines, doing commercials for American sponsors that are the most conservative companies in the world when it comes to commercial endorsements? They don't want someone who's crazy. They don't want someone who's wild. They want a hero.
From the early 70s, Jacobs and Cayton were funding the training camp that Cus D'Amato had in upstate New York. Occasionally, he would call and say he had a great young prospect. In 1980, he called and said his newest prospect was a kid named Mike Tyson. The first time Steve met Mike was for about 5 seconds in 1982 when he came into the city with Cus. Then in 1984, he stayed with Steve at his apartment in the city for 2 weeks while he had therapy on a hand injury which delayed his professional debut. Then after each fight, he would stay with Steve in the city for a day to take a break in between fights.
And we would go to the hand doctor twice a day for therapy. We'd go to the movies in the evening, we'd go hang out. And that was the first time I actually met Mike and we got to know each other. But after the 5 days, Cus came down to the city to pick him up. And Cus said, "Thanks a lot, Steve, for taking care of Mike." I said, "No problem, Cus." I was ready to shake Mike's hand and say, "Hey, Mike, take care." And Mike came over to me and gave me this great hug. This great hug. He said, "Thanks, Steve. Thanks. Thank you."
When he became champ, he would stay for 2 or 3 weeks. People couldn't believe that the heavyweight champion of the world was sharing Steve's apartment and sleeping on the couch, no less. Steve first met Cus D'Amato in 1974 while he was fixing some stereo equipment at Jim Jacobs' apartment in New York City. Cus came over and asked Steve what he was doing and mentioned that it looked very complicated. After Steve explained what he was doing, Cus asked him when his birthday was. Now initially, Steve thought that this was a bit of a weird question, but nonetheless he answered January 17th. Cus looked at him and said, "You're alright." It wasn't until many years later that Steve found out that Cus was very much into astrology. It's well known that Cus didn't let anyone around his fighters, and he was extremely protective of his boys. For example, during his amateur career, in between fights, if Mike had to use the restroom, Cus would have someone accompany Mike to make sure that no one talked to him. The fact that Cus permitted Mike to stay with Steve at his apartment unsupervised says a lot about what Cus thought about Steve. That's the ultimate compliment from Cus. Steve developed the Boxing Hall of Fame Las Vegas, which was originally located at the Luxor Hotel and Casino before moving online. From 2010 to 2019, Steve's dedication and tireless efforts generated a larger online following than any other sports Hall of Fame in the world, including the NBA, NHL, NFL, and MLB, with over 900,000 followers. In 2019, Steve partnered with Official Boxing Gods and saw the following grow from 900,000 to over 1.4 million in less than a year. Like his mentor Jim Jacobs, Steve was an obsessive collector of old fight films and photographs that he began to amass in the early 70s. Steve owned the rights to these films and photographs, and he would license them for use in documentaries and for publication. Official Boxing Gods acquired Steve Lott's vast and one-of-a-kind photo and video library, including the exclusive worldwide rights. Steve credits Jim Jacobs with having a huge influence on him in several areas. Jim was the world handball champion when Steve began playing handball. Steve had no natural physical ability, but that wasn't a factor in Jim's mind. he told Steve that the key to being accomplished was the thinking process. Deciding to make the right shot when you have milliseconds to think. And he was right. Even though Steve had no natural physical ability, he went on to win several national championships because of his ability to stay calm under pressure. Steve described Jim's demeanor as very heartwarming. Anyone who met Jim felt welcomed. And Jim remained that way to the very end. Steve always maintained Jim's greatest quality was that of forgiveness. The equation goes like this. If someone does something that affects you and it was unintentional, you discuss it and then you let it go completely. But if someone does something that affects you and it was intentional, that's a different story. Steve recalled making huge mistakes during his years at big fights, and Jim recognized that they were unintentional. No matter how disastrous they were, he discussed the incident with him, then let it go. Now that's tough to do. It's a given that Steve's favorite fighters of all time are Muhammad Ali and Mike Tyson. But did you know that outside of those two, these are his top 3 favorite fighters? At number 3, the Hawk, Aaron Pryor. At number 2, Hands of Stone, Roberto Duran. And at number 1, the Admirable, Joe Louis, who Steve believed was the most loved and adored athlete in history. Steve's most memorable fight for which he didn't work the corner was Thrilla in Manila, Ali vs. Frazier III. Steve was just a couple of years into his tenure as a film editor at Big Fights, and Jim was kind enough to take Steve and his girlfriend to the fight. Every time Steve saw the fight, he could see him and his girlfriend right there in the 3rd row. Talk about memorable. Here's a couple of great stories that Steve held near and dear to him that occurred during his trip to Manila. Steve and his girlfriend at the time were on the balcony looking across the street of their hotel when they saw what appeared to be a handball court. They both made their way down and started playing. Soon thereafter, a group of kids approached them and asked them what game they were playing. In typical Steve fashion, he took the opportunity to show the young kids of Manila the game of handball. Pictured here, you can see one of the young boys wearing the gloves that Steve gave him to keep. During that same trip, Jim told Steve that they were going to watch Ali's public workout, which started the next day at 11 a.m. sharp. When the next day rolled around, it was almost noon. So naturally, Steve thought that they would have to sit at whichever seats were still available. But little did Steve know at the time just how powerful and respected Jim Jacobs really was. At this point, it's almost 1 p.m. and Jim, Steve, and Steve's girlfriend walked into the arena to watch the workout, and it's jam-packed. Just as Steve starts to think that they may have to turn around, he hears someone from the ring shout, "Hey Jim, get up here!" It was none other than Angelo Dundee, waving Jim through the huge crowd right onto the stage next to the ring, where Ali was shadowboxing, as seen in this photo here taken by Steve. Steve recalls the sea of fans parting so they could make their way through. His exact words were, "It was unreal." Can you imagine how much Steve learned from Jim, Cus, and Bill over the years? Being around that brain power? Steve made it clear that the most important lesson he learned from them was how to deal with pressure. Everyone experiences pressure. Now how do you handle it? Jim Jacobs had the philosophy that in any situation, you must ask yourself, what do I want to do versus what's the smart thing for me to do? That's a tough decision. Steve was lucky. He witnessed Jim Jacobs, Cus D'Amato, and Bill Cayton make decisions under pressure over and over again. He knew what they wanted to do, but they always made the decision to do the smart thing. That's what made them masters. Over the years, Steve fostered many lifelong friendships. Here are a few of his friends sharing their fondest memories of him.
First met Steve Lott in New York City in around 1980 at a weekend handball tournament that was being held at the West 63rd Street YMCA. I was actually playing in it. I think I lost in the second round, and from then on I was just watching the better players perform, and that's the first time I saw Steve Lott, and he was playing in the tournament. And right away I was impressed with how wonderful a player he was, and came to find out that he was a protege of Jimmy Jacobs, who was arguably the greatest player who had ever played handball at that time. So then, I would see him around at the New York Athletic Club, a couple other tournaments, and we always ended up chatting, and I really liked him a lot. He was a nice guy, very friendly. Eventually, I moved to California to keep doing what I do for a living, and Steve moved to Las Vegas to work on opening up the Boxing Hall of Fame. And we kept in touch. We would call each other on the phone, sometimes talk for an hour and a half about boxing, which he was well versed in, handball, of course. And it was just I always enjoyed talking to him. Sometimes I might do him a little favor. He may call and ask if I knew somebody and could I introduce them, and I was happy to do it. And he would do me little favors every now and then. He'd send me boxing t-shirts and hats, and it was just a nice relationship over many, many years. And I didn't realize he was ill, so I was shocked and saddened when I found out that Steve had died. He was a nice guy, and I'm happy to say that.
Hi, Dr. Scott Weiss here with Confusing the Enemy, the Cus D'Amato story. I was so privileged to be able to write the first book in the world on Cus D'Amato, but in part, I owe a lot of that to Steve Lott. On my journey of researching Cus, I met Steve in about 2003. Serendipitously, Steve lived up the block from me in New York City. I lived on 30th and Madison at that time, and he happened to have been on 40th and Madison on the 17th floor. And not only would he share stories with me and old memorabilia from big fights, but he invited me several times to his apartment on the 17th floor, and we would talk about Cus, we would talk about Mike, we would talk about stories about Jimmy Jacobs and Bill Cayton and how much he hated Robin Givens and Don King and what was going on in boxing these days, about managers, what they're doing and not doing. But again, Steve was so influential, I just had to take part in this tribute. Steve, we all wish you were still around. Cheers, my friend. Thank you for all your work.
Steve Lott and I were part of a very unique boxing family. We shared moments in boxing history that will never be equaled, and I think will never be as stunning as the ones that we experienced. I would like to say that Steve was a most honorable person of great character, wisdom, dedication, determination. He was always willing to help, always willing to pick up the phone, and to put the caller at ease with a joke. I don't think he was appreciated as much as he should have been. I know that the world is a lesser place without him in it. My only comfort is that I'm sure he is happy and appreciated where he is now. One of his favorite jokes was about his birthday, January 17th, the same day as Muhammad Ali, the same birthday as Cus D'Amato, my mentor. Steve said, "Oh well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad." Love him.
It's a privilege to actually celebrate and reflect on Steve Lott's life. One of the most influential guys and humble guy I ever met. I've got to know Steve over the last 10 years or so, but I felt like I've always known him. Someone I've always seen on videos, and back in them days with VHS videos, we used to watch everything to do with sort of Cus D'Amato, Mike Tyson, the old boxing videos. Steve Lott was always there, taking pictures on his camera. I thought, what an amazing guy, who is this guy? I was very much intrigued. Little did I know that I'd end up being someone that would be chatting to him and talking to him, and he supported me a lot through my different events that we've held in the UK. Steve Lott was someone who always made time for you. He always had time to answer any questions. He was never in his way or never a problem for him. And if he could send out stuff to you by the post, he did. He sent me out t-shirts, gloves signed, you know, and then I think the best moment was when Mayweather fought Pacquiao. Steve Lott and me met in Vegas. And up until this time, we only chatted on email or by telephone. For 10 years, we obviously never met, and that one time we met, and went for a coffee, and it was one of the most beautiful experiences I'll always remember and cherish, because this guy was bigger than life. He had so much to tell me about the boxing, about the management, the old days, especially the old days with Mike and Tom Patty and people that I've got to know over the years. Always an amazing guy, and the world is definitely missing a special person now. And I will always remember Steve Lott for his sense of humour. Boy, could he tell jokes. He'd drop a joke in at the most serious point of a conversation, and you think, where's that coming from? And I'll tell you one thing, it happened in stitches. So Steve, one love, always remembered you.
Steve was a very resilient and hard-working man, a true Capricorn. He absolutely loved the poem entitled, "Don't Quit." He used to call the poem his words to live by, and it was cousin Jim's favorite poem too. If you're ever having a tough time, read this poem. You'll never forget it.